we turn our attention now to study the basics of arguments. So both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are focused on a panoramic view of critical thinking. And then once we get through Chapter 2, we'll start drilling down respectively into deductive and then inductive reasoning. So what we're doing is looking at argumentation in rather broad terms at present, and then once we have grasped not only what the basics of an argument are, but also the crucial evaluation concepts for respectively reasoning deductively and reasoning inductively, we will then turn our attention to some more technical ways that we can reason deductively and reason inductively. More specifically, we'll turn our attention in our study of deductive reasoning to a study of categorical logic and then natural deduction. And then in terms of inductive reasoning, we will focus on analogical, causal, and scientific reasoning. So the really crucial points for you to focus on here will be how you understand what an argument is, what the parts of an argument are, and then how you evaluate arguments. Now, we're going, as I mentioned before, to divide our focus between deductive evaluation concepts and inductive evaluation concepts, but you could take any argument, strictly speaking, you could take any argument and, strictly speaking, evaluate it according to the rules of validity or the standards of strength and come up with an evaluation. But what we're going to do is to treat certain types of argument as deductive and certain types of argument as inductive and evaluate accordingly. So here's a basic overview of what we're covering without too much in the way of technical terminology. So when we study logic, we're focused on the study of correct reasoning. Typically, when we study logic in an academic environment, we're focused on deductive logic. So what we're focused on is a question of whether or not the form of the argument is such that the premises guarantee the conclusion. We'll see that when we look at an inductive piece of reasoning, it will never be the case that an inductive argument's premises guarantee the conclusion. Instead, the question for evaluating that sort of reasoning is how likely it is, given the premises, that the conclusion is true. So let's start off by chatting a little bit about, in general terms, about arguments.
Anywhere is a good place for an argument. Arguments are not mere disputes between people. Arguments are a part of our daily lives insofar as we're often in the business of reasoning about simple things. Let me give you an example, or a few examples. Should I wake up early to eat before my first morning class, or sleep in a bit but not get to eat until lunch? Should I try to work an extra shift so I can buy the latest BioShock, or use the time I'd be working to study for my biology exam instead? Should I apologize to my best friend for canceling our movie date because I really wanted to do something else? When you ask yourself and begin to answer these sorts of questions, you're engaged in reasoning. In other words, what you do, for example, is lay out the pros and cons of whether or not you should wake up early to eat or sleep in a bit. The pros and cons of working an extra shift versus studying for your exam, and so forth. And when you weigh those pros and cons, you arrive at a decision. And this is one way that you can think about an argument, which is going to more formally be a chain of reasons in support of some claim or other. So first, let's start out with the most basic component of an argument. An argument is made up of statements. And a statement is a sentence that makes a claim. In other words, a statement describes some state of affairs or prescribes, let's say, some course of action. So a statement is a sentence that makes a claim, and as such, it's true or false. So when we're talking about an argument, we're talking about a collection of sentences that have each of which has what's called a truth value. Each sentence is either true or false, and together those sentences lead you to a final sentence, which is the point of the argument. So look at each of these sentences. Is the door open? The door is open. Close the door now. And the door is open. The punctuation gives you some indication of how you're meant to take the sentence. The first one is a question, the second one is an exclamation, but the way that you read the third sentence, close the door now, and the way you read the fourth sentence, the door is open, depends on the meaning of the sentence. So the third sentence gives you a command, and the fourth sentence is merely a description. So of these four sentences, the fourth one is a statement. As such, it can be a candidate for an argument. So we have a question, an exclamation, a command, and a statement. When you have a collection of statements that bear an inferential relationship to each other, you have an argument. So, for example, when you have a collection of statements, one of which is inferred from the others, you have an argument. The statement that is inferred is called the conclusion. The statements from which the conclusion is inferred are called the premises. Here's an example. We should boycott that company. They have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries. Notice that the second statement gives you a reason to believe that we should boycott that company, which is the first statement. In addition to recognizing the inferential flow of an argument, you can identify an argument by way of indicator words. Indicator words are like alerts. They say, hey, I have a premise coming up, or hey, I've got a conclusion coming up. The words themselves are not part of the premise or conclusion, but they tell you that one has just been asserted or is about to be asserted. So take a look at the words highlighted in blue. Since they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, we should therefore boycott that company. Indicator words let you know what parts of the argument you're looking at. They help you to know that you're looking at an argument and which is or which are the premises and which is the conclusion. Here are a bunch of indicator words. Notice that the conclusion indicator words and the premise indicator words and phrases tell you about the part of an argument that you're looking at. Remember, they're like alerts. They signal that there is or just has been a premise or conclusion asserted. So take a look at a given argument, and the first thing you might consider doing is looking at indicator words or looking for indicator words and phrases. Let's take a look at an example. Buy an Apple instead of a Windows computer because Apple computers have more features for graphic artists and you are a graphic artist. We've got the word because in this passage, and the word because acts as a premise indicator word. Notice the way that the argument is laid out. Each of the premises is put one on top of the other, so is laid out one on top of the other, and the conclusion is laid out on the bottom. When you're working on identifying your premises and your conclusion of a given argument, consider reworking the argument, rewrite the argument in this way: premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, etc., and then put your conclusion on the bottom. That format will help you see the structure of the argument. Here's another example. You should buy an iPad instead of a notebook. You should also buy a Honda instead of a Toyota, and a Vizio television instead of a Sony. Now, notice here you have a whole bunch of claims. You should do this, you should do that, you should do the other, but no reason to believe that any of the claims is worth acting upon or is worth accepting as true. Consequently, this passage is not an argument. So there are two ways that you can identify an argument. Look for an inferential flow. Is there a reasoning process that's expressed by the argument? Another way that you can identify an argument is to look for indicator words and phrases. More specifically, consider narrowing your search whenever possible to looking for a conclusion. Once you have the conclusion, you can identify the rest of the elements of the argument as premises. So one of the ways in which we distinguish arguments from non-arguments is by way of distinguishing an argument from an explanation. Now, just so you know, it's not always easy to do this. Depending on the audience, depending on how much those people know, one person's explanation may be another person's argument. But generally speaking, the way that you distinguish an argument from an explanation is that an explanation does not seek to prove, it simply seeks to explain. So compare these two examples. Because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. Your back injury occurred because you lifted weights without first getting a physical checkup. Here is the premise. Because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. We know that this is an argument not simply because you have the indicator word because, but because of the inferential flow between the two parts of the passage. On the other hand, something that's already happened or that is already an accepted fact simply becomes a source of explanation. You're not attempting to prove that you didn't get a physical checkup. You're simply explaining what happened and why it happened or how it happened. I couldn't do my homework because I had to work a double shift yesterday. Question: is this an argument or an explanation? So ask yourself this: is the person trying to prove that they couldn't do their homework, right? Remember, the indicator word because alerts you to, in the case of an argument, a premise coming up. But here, is it the case that you're trying to prove by way of, I had to work a double shift yesterday, that you couldn't do your homework? Or is it the case that it's an established fact that you couldn't do your homework and you're simply trying to explain it? It's an explanation. It is already a fact that the homework was not done, so an explanation is being offered. Now, just to reiterate, I know that when you're first starting out, it's not always easy to distinguish an argument from a non-argument. More specifically, it's not always easy to distinguish an argument from an explanation. But if you bear in mind this concept of an inferential flow, that is, that you are reasoning your way to a claim as opposed to simply accepting that claim as a fact and explaining it, then you've got a nice way of distinguishing an argument from an explanation. The last part of today's video concerns the relationship between truth and logic, and this is a relationship that's not always easy to bear in mind as you're working. Most of us are really interested in whether or not a claim is true. And in logic, we're not so much interested in whether or not a claim is true as we are interested in whether or not the claim is supported by the other claims in the argument. In other words, the conclusion of an argument is said to be true based on the support it's gotten from the premises, not on any features of the world, any facts about the world. So that's why we distinguish between a truth value analysis and a logical analysis. When we're looking to see whether or not a sentence is actually true, we're looking to see if the information in the premises is accurate, correct, or true. It is raining is either true or false. When we're looking at an argument, we conduct a logical analysis. In other words, if we want to know whether or not a sentence is true from the standpoint of logic, we're asking whether or not that sentence is supported by the other sentences in the argument. So when we conduct a logical analysis, we're determining the strength with which the premises support the conclusion. In this example, it is raining. When it rains, games are usually canceled. Therefore, the game is probably canceled. Here, we're looking to see whether or not the sentence, the game is probably canceled, is adequately supported. In other words, is it true based on what the premises tell us? So we're really talking about inferential truth, not factual truth. The way that I like to introduce the distinction between deductive arguments and inductive arguments is not by way of their technical names, but by way of what you already understand. So you can think of a deductive argument as an argument that does not rely on experience in order for you to derive the conclusion. I think you've all seen those Happy Cows commercials.
Hey, Grandma, you were born here like we were, right, Grandma? Hey, Grandma, how come you never talk about Wisconsin? Wisconsin. I told you not to ask her that. Grandma?
Great cheese comes from happy cows. Happy cows come from California.
An inductive argument relies on experience for the progression from premises to conclusion. So for example, if I walk out to my car, I put the key in the ignition, I turn the ignition and nothing happens, take the key out of the ignition, put the key back in, turn the ignition, nothing happens, I will likely infer that my battery is dead. Now, I can't get just from thinking about putting a key in the ignition and turning the ignition to the conclusion, my battery is dead, without experience. Either my own experience of previously having had dead car batteries, or from hearing from other people that typically when your car doesn't turn over, and in fact it doesn't even try to turn over, that the battery is dead. Now, inductive arguments or experiential arguments have a different premise to conclusion relationship than do deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are arguments in which it is claimed that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. In other words, if the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. On the other hand, an inductive argument has a relationship of probability between premises and conclusion. The premises make it more or less likely, depending on how good the argument is, for the conclusion to be true. One of the ways that you can tell the difference between an inductive and a deductive argument is how the argument is set up. In other words, the language that's used. Of course, this is not going to guarantee that you can distinguish an inductive distinguish between an inductive and a deductive argument. Perhaps the easiest way to distinguish between an inductive and a deductive argument is that deductive arguments are typically Those arguments that are involved in mathematics, geometry, for example, arguments by definition. On the other hand, inductive arguments tend to be arguments from analogy, probabilistic or statistical arguments, scientific arguments. Let's take a look at an example to see how your understanding of the distinction between deductive and inductive arguments is going. Most college freshmen have part-time jobs. Sue is a college freshman, thus Sue has a part-time job. The reason why this argument is inductive is because the conclusion is not guaranteed. In other words, just because most college freshmen have part-time jobs and Sue is a college freshman does not guarantee that she is one of those who has a part-time job. Take a look at how this argument can be reformulated in order to make it deductive. All college freshmen have part-time jobs. Sue is a college freshman, thus Sue has a part-time job. If the premises are true, then it follows necessarily that Sue has a part-time job. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about what is meant by saying that an argument whose premises guarantees its conclusion is a deductive argument. More specifically, an argument whose premises guarantee its conclusion is classified or evaluated as a valid argument. So this is going to take a little bit of practice on your part to really grasp. But for right now, you want to work with the definition of validity. An argument is valid when it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So, for example, I can say, hey, I have candy in my right hand or my left hand. Since the candy is not in my right hand, it follows that it's in my left hand. If the premises are true, and the premises are, I have candy in my right hand or my left hand, candy is not in my right hand, then the conclusion has to be true. Candy's therefore in my left hand. It doesn't matter whether or not I actually have candy in my right hand or my left hand. If it's true that candy is in my right hand or my left hand and it's not in my right hand, it must be true that the candy's in my left hand, just as a matter of deduction. When, on the other hand, your premises don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, then the argument is invalid. Let's take a look at some examples. So here we have on the left side of your screen an argument. Remember we talked a bit earlier about putting your premises one on top of the other and then your conclusion on the bottom. Here we have that arrangement, and the line that you see separates the premises from the conclusion. So the premises are all beagles are dogs, all dogs are mammals, therefore all beagles are mammals. It has the following form: all B are D, all D are M, all B are M. The way that you know this argument is valid for right now is by definition of validity. In other words, if it's true that all beagles are dogs, and it's also true that all dogs are mammals, the form of the argument forces you to accept the conclusion. Remember that happy cows argument that we were talking about earlier? So I can substitute beagles, dogs, and mammals with milk, happy cows in California. All great milk comes from happy cows. All happy cows come from California, so all great milk comes from California. Any substitution of the argument that has the form you're seeing is going to be a valid argument. So here's another thing that you can think about when you're thinking about validity. Validity is not about the content of the argument. It's not about the actual truth or falsity of the sentences in the argument. It's about the structure or form of the argument. Okay, now let's say something more about the evaluation concepts. We know what makes an argument valid. An argument is valid when it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. And what you do is you assume the premises are true and see if those premises thereby force the conclusion to be true. Okay? But you can also think in terms of soundness. A sound argument is a valid argument, and in fact the content, the premises, is good, are good. So the content is good, or the premises are true. An unsound argument is one that is invalid, or the argument could be valid, but at least one of the premises is false. Now, you're probably feeling a little bit like you're playing mental twister, but remember that we're focusing on the concept of validity, and then the additional concept is one of soundness. So a valid argument is structurally correct. A sound argument is not only structurally correct, the content is also true. So let's go back to this example. I believe it's true that all beagles are dogs. I also believe it's true that all dogs are mammals. And so, in terms of content, we have actually true premises. The argument is valid, and so we have a sound argument. A sound argument is valid and the premises are actually true. If we're just looking at the form, which you see in the blue box, there's no way to determine content. In other words, we can't tell, other than the argument being valid, if the argument is also sound. When we have an argument that's invalid, we have an argument whose premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So what you can do when you believe you have an invalid argument is you can substitute for the terms in the original argument sentences that are true for the premises but false for the conclusion. So if you look in the blue box, you'll see the following argument. All B are S, all G are S, all B are G. Just looking at the argument, just eyeballing it, you may not be able to see that the argument is invalid. But if you think it might be invalid, what you do is take true premises, so look over to your right, all men are human beings, that's true. All women are human beings, that's true. But the conclusion does not follow, it's actually false. All men are women. So an invalid argument is one in which the conclusion is not guaranteed by the premises. Just because the premises are assumed true or are in fact true does not mean that your conclusion must also be true. Let's take an example and see how you're doing. No C are B, no C are S, no B are S. The question is, does this argument's conclusion follow necessarily from the premises? In other words, if the premises are true, must it be the case that the conclusion is true? And the answer is no. Take C, B, and S and replace them with crocodiles, boas, and snakes. It's true that no crocodiles are boa constrictors. It's also true that no crocodiles are snakes, but it's false that no boa constrictors are snakes. In fact, a boa constrictor is a type of snake. So when you can substitute for the elements in an argument, true premises and a false conclusion, you know your argument is invalid. Now let's talk a bit about inductive arguments. Inductive arguments do not have the same level of guarantee or certainty that you get with deductive arguments that are valid. So what you get with an inductive argument is a matter of likelihood. how likely is it that if the premises are true, the conclusion is thereby also true? And for the most part, the amount of experience that you have will tell you what to do in terms of evaluating the argument. In other words, your argument is going to be strong if it's the case that the premises make the conclusion likely. And what I mean by saying that your experience will help you here is because inductive arguments are experiential, the more you know about the world, the more experiences you know about or have had, the better able you are to see whether or not the premises support the conclusion. But in terms of the basic definitions, we have the following. An argument is strong when the premises make it probable that the conclusion is true. Here is an example of a strong inductive argument and an example of a weak inductive argument. So you've got three premises in example A, which is the strong inductive argument. An opaque jar contains exactly 100 marbles. There are 99 blue marbles in the jar. There is one red marble in the jar. Therefore, the marble that is picked is blue. So the likelihood of picking a blue marble is pretty significant, right? On the other hand, if you infer that you're going to pick a red marble, that's very unlikely. So notice that here we're just talking about probability. What's the likelihood based on numbers that you're going to pick a blue marble? Well, it's pretty darn likely. What's the likelihood you're going to pick a red marble? Pretty unlikely. Now let's take a look at cogency. A cogent argument is a strong argument and the premises are actually true. On the other hand, an uncogent argument is weak, or it could be a strong argument but have at least one false premise. You're probably noticing a pattern here. Deductive arguments are valid or invalid. Deductive arguments that are valid can be sound or unsound, and all invalid arguments are unsound. With inductive arguments, you evaluate in terms of strength or weakness. Strong inductive arguments can be cogent or uncogent, and all weak inductive arguments are uncogent. Let's take a look at the example again. I don't have a jar in front of me, let alone one that's opaque and containing 100 marbles, 99 of which are blue, one of which is red. So I have no way of knowing if this argument is cogent or uncogent, right? In terms of first evaluating it as strong. It may be strong and cogent if there is in fact an opaque jar that contains 100 marbles, 99 of which are blue, one of which is red, right? So cogency has to do with an argument that is strong and that also has true premises. Let's take a look at this example. Most politicians are liars. Madison is a liar, thus she is a politician. We don't have a way to connect Madison with being a politician. There's a connection between politicians and lying and Madison and lying, but that doesn't mean that the liar class connects Madison with politicians. On the other hand, if you say most politicians are liars, Madison is a politician, thus she is a liar, you've got a strong inductive argument because the preponderance of politicians are liars, and so it's more likely that if Madison is a politician, she is a liar.
Before moving on to the next level of evaluation, let's remind ourselves by way of some additional ways of talking about validity, what it is that we mean when we say that an argument is valid. We want to think in terms of the premises providing us sufficient support for the conclusion, that is, that the premises guarantee the conclusion. We want to think in terms of it being impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true, or the conclusion to be false while the premises are true. We want to think in terms of the conclusion following necessarily, that is, that the conclusion is forced to be true when the premises are true, or that the relationship is one of certainty. The relationship between premises and conclusion is one of certainty. So when we say that it is impossible for a conclusion to be false while the premises are true when an argument is valid, what we're saying is that trying to make the conclusion false contradicts what we say about the premises, namely that the premises are true. So, if you find that you feel a little bit confused about what is meant when you say that an argument is valid, because you feel like you're toggling between what you know to be true, what you believe to be true, and simply what you assume to be true for the sake of evaluating the argument. So I think for most of us, this difficulty emerges most strikingly when we're dealing with an invalid argument. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the counterexample method. But bear these ways of talking about validity as we go forward. Okay, so the best deductive argument, in fact, one would say the best argument, period, precisely because of the airtightness, if you will, of the argument, is a sound argument. A sound argument is a valid argument, and the premises are actually true. This is the sort of argument that we want, because we want the sort of certainty that validity brings us, and we also don't want to waste our time simply arguing validly without the content bearing fruit, if you will. So a sound argument is defined first by validity. So an invalid argument can never be sound. So a sound argument is valid and the premises are actually true. Look at the two examples. Each of the two examples, sorry, let me rephrase that. Both examples share the same form. So the moon is made of green cheese, Mitt Romney's U.S. president. Each of these arguments has the same form, but the content is different. So the moon is made of green cheese, that argument is valid but unsound. Mitt Romney or Barack Obama was 44th U.S. president, that argument is also valid but unsound. Now let's talk a bit about cogency. We know that a strong inductive argument is an argument whose premises make the conclusion very likely to be true or likely to be true. You can think about likelihood again in terms of how convinced you are if you don't have more than, let's say, anecdotal evidence, right, for your belief. Or you can think in terms of percentages, right? 51%, strictly speaking, is greater than or more likely than 49%, right? So when you think about strength, you can think in terms of likelihood. Cogency includes the characteristic or the state of being strong, and on top of that, the premises are actually true. Take a look at each of the examples to see what I mean. So we can talk about a strong argument, but the argument is not cogent because one of the premises is false. Right? So if you didn't know it, John F. Kennedy was not age 48 when elected U.S. president. I think he was 43. He was quite young. So the argument's strong, not cogent. The second argument is cogent because it's not only strong, but the premises are actually true. Right? So we'll look at a chart in a little bit where you can see a parallel between the evaluation concepts for a deductive argument and the evaluation concepts for an inductive argument. Right? For a deductive argument, we have the evaluation concepts validity and invalidity. We also have soundness and unsoundness. So we'll say for a deductive argument, it's valid or invalid. A valid argument can be sound or unsound. All invalid arguments are unsound. And then we have the parallel concepts for inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are strong or weak. All weak arguments are uncogent. Some strong arguments are cogent. Some strong arguments are not cogent, or aka uncogent. Okay, lastly, before we do a sort of a summary of what we've covered in this video, the entirety of this video, let's talk a bit about the counterexample method. So one of the skills that you want to develop involves applying or attempting to apply the counterexample method to a deductive argument. So it's going to be the case that when an argument is invalid, you can use a substitution method or the counterexample method to demonstrate invalidity. And that involves maintaining the form or structure of the argument, but substituting for the content, other content that allows you to assert true premises and a false conclusion. You can also use or attempt to use the counterexample method when you're testing an argument for validity. So it should be clear when you attempt to falsify the conclusion of a valid argument that you can't, right? It's fairly clear, at least I hope anyway, that attempting to falsify the conclusion of a valid argument very quickly shows you that in so making the attempt, you contradict your premises. Not so with an invalid argument. Take a look at the two examples in blue. On the left-hand side is an invalid argument. On the right-hand side is an invalid argument. Both share the same form, but while we might agree that, yes, some beagles are friendly. In fact, it's true that some beagles are friendly. And so you might get lulled into thinking the argument is correct when it's not. The substitution method that the argument on the right reflects shows us that the form is not correct. In other words, the form does not allow us to say that the argument is valid. So the same form for the beagles and the fruits, right, arguments. Content is different. In the second example, some fruits are oranges, some fruits are apples. So some oranges or apples, we can see clearly that the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. That tells us that the argument is invalid.
Here's a chart that should help you organize your thinking. At the top, we have the concept of an argument. We know that an argument is a set of statements, one of which is supported by the other or others. There are two types of argument, deductive and inductive. We evaluate deductive arguments in terms of validity and soundness. A deductive argument that is valid is an argument whose premises guarantee the conclusion. In other words, if the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. A valid argument that's sound is an argument whose premises guarantee the conclusion and whose premises are actually true. So remember, the distinction between validity and soundness is a distinction between structure and content. Soundness is a concept that includes structure and goes beyond structure to include content. Validity has to do with nothing but the structure of the argument. On the other side, an inductive argument is strong or weak. A strong inductive argument is one whose premises make the conclusion very likely. A strong inductive argument that is cogent is an inductive argument whose premises not only, if true, make the conclusion very likely, but whose premises are in fact true.
I hope that this overview of argumentation is helpful in making sense of how we can think about two modes of reasoning, as well as how we can evaluate those two modes of reasoning. What we'll be moving into next is a more focused study of, respectively, deductive arguments and inductive arguments.